Welcome back, I'm Hermine. The summer of 2025 marked the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, with commemorations taking place across Europe. As time goes by, fewer and fewer eyewitnesses of the war are still around. So how can we make sure we never forget about what actually happened in the past? And how can we make sure that rumours and fake news don't mess up our memories? Nadja Dangelmeier, an education researcher at Alpen-Adria-Universität in Austria, works on keeping the memory of Nazi crimes alive. One of the most powerful ways, she says, is having descendants of eyewitnesses visit schools and share their family stories.
In
recent years, there have been many inquiries from descendants of eyewitnesses, from children and grandchildren who have said, "My mother or grandmother can no longer go into schools, but I would like to do so. I would like to engage in dialogue with young people."
This kind of initiative, she adds, makes history much more concrete for young people.
To
such a person, it becomes clear that this past is not as long ago as 80 years seems to young people today. Because when a 35-year-old woman sits there, for example, and talks about how she spoke to her grandmother about her persecution, what her own grandmother told her about the time she spent as a 14-year-old girl in the Theresienstadt ghetto, brings the issues to life, making them no longer as distant as one might have thought.
Mihai Ghițulescu, a history and political science professor at the University of Craiova in Romania, believes that to ensure historical transmission to a wide audience, it has to become part of our popular culture. He shares his ideas.
I'm sure literature and cinema can convey an accurate memory of evil, for example. I think that for most people, these kinds of stories have more of an impact than dry historical discussion, however well-meaning it may be.
Of course, telling history completely objectively is almost impossible. Even people who were there, even eyewitnesses, see things differently. We all filter facts through our culture, our community, our role, our experience, and how those events affected us personally. Those who have the power to spread their own interpretation will usually be the winning side, says Carlos Belloso, a historian at the University of Valladolid in Spain. But even that story isn't fixed forever, he adds. Each new generation comes along and reshapes the facts in its own way.
Las guerras las escriben los vencedores y desde la guerra de las Galias de Julio César.
Wars are written about by the victors. From Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars to the present day, it's pretty much the same story. But the thing is, history is usually interpreted through the eyes and in the light of the present moment. In other words, we evolve and change. And every time we look back at the past, it takes on a different slant, with greater emphasis on one element or another.
Once there are no longer any living eyewitnesses, people tend to reinterpret historical accounts more. Events, when taken out of context, can appear to be more significant than they actually were at the time. Furthermore, with the current rise of populist parties in Europe and around the world, we are witnessing the construction of national or regional identities based on historical facts and events that are often oversimplified and romanticized. They are taken out of context and are loaded with strong emotional associations. These romanticized interpretations of the past seek to highlight the past glories or victim status of certain population while demonizing their supposed enemies. Let's return to Mihai Ghițulescu.
The dangers of manipulation stem from the fact that in choosing to look into the past, they are seeking to spread hatred, or if hatred is too strong a word, at least create tensions between people on the basis of supposed historical events. Essentially, in order to criticize the current system, they appeal to alleged past injustices, and I repeat, alleged. But by referring to history, they make themselves sound more legitimate.
And this does not only apply to populist leaders or people in power. Today, anyone can offer their own interpretation of history, and social media acts as an amplifier. Of course, young people may be more likely to believe this reinterpretation of history, but they're not the only ones who fall for biased reinterpretations. So who can help set the record straight? Well, even though populists like to call them elitist, professional historians actually play a key role here. They're the ones on the front lines pushing back against fake news and twisted versions of the past, and making sure our understanding of history stays grounded in real evidence. Valdas Rakutis, a Lithuanian MP and historian, shares his views on the matter.
It is the duty of intellectuals to be able to provide people with some clarity about who they, the societies, are and where they are going, and to protect them from all kinds of extremes.
Their job is to make sense of how societies work and change over time. When something from the past starts echoing in today's world, they're the ones who can point it out and help us see the bigger picture, says Panayotis Ioachimidis, an emeritus professor of European politics at the University of Athens.
Even if we want to move on from the past, history gives us certain guidelines and teaches us certain lessons, if we are willing to learn. It also shows us how to avoid the worst.
In this sense, Ioachimidis and other historians we spoke to say there are quite a few similarities between today and the 1930s.
It also shows us how to avoid the worst. The rise of nationalism and ethno-populism in Europe today bears certain resemblances to the phenomena of the 1930s. Of course, at present, precisely because we have European integration, because we have Central European institutions, because we have systems and policies of solidarity within the European Union, this phenomenon is less poisonous and toxic than it was in the 1930s. Nonetheless, it still represents a threat to Europe, to democracy, to integration, to stability, and to peace. Take, for instance, the situation on the Eastern Front, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russia's aggression stems from an intense, toxic, and poisonous form of Russian nationalism, even imperialism, if you will. Therefore, we cannot say that Europe has definitively closed certain historical chapters.
Charles Goerens, a Luxembourgish MEP from the liberal Renew Europe group, adds that an understanding of events unfurling in the late 1930s can offer us some guiding principles for making the right political and societal choices today.
Politics certainly has a responsibility. Civil society has a responsibility, and does the economy. In these dangerous times, we must stop abandoning ourselves to a kind of fatalism in which we accept this division of responsibilities.
Professor Ioachimidis believes that with the right approach, we could effectively combat this trend back towards extremism.
We must cultivate the necessary reflexes and develop appropriate responses that do not merely react to the symptoms, but address the deeper causes that give rise to such movements. In most cases, these root causes are social in nature: inequality, poverty, social exclusion, and in some cases, the challenges posed by migration. Yet all too often, we choose to ignore the signs, the messages that reality is sending us. And when that happens, we risk reaching a point where managing the consequences becomes profoundly difficult.
European history is full of division. Member states have fought against one another for far, far longer than they have been united. That is why, says Ioachimidis, The integration of European nations is so fundamental. He calls this ongoing process post-historical, as in his words, it transcends history, it looks past it.
The founding fathers of European integration sought to forget the negative aspects and traumas of European history, the European civil wars, and to construct a new political system that would guarantee peace and stability and prevent political conflicts and confrontations from leading to bloodshed and destruction.
Contrarily to a nation-state that's usually built on a national myth, the EU decided to do just the opposite. This doesn't mean Europe has been able to wipe the slate completely clean. Ioannidis also says there are still some tricky issues to deal with, and they could cause a lot of problems. It is at times like this that we must remember that the EU is itself a legacy of the past, a message from the generation that lived through the World War to future generations.
It is also a fact that European integration was primarily built by the generation that had lived through the traumas of the Second World War. Consequently, younger generations who do not share these lived experiences often find it more difficult to grasp the historicity of certain events.
To bring this discussion to a close here, a fellow journalist, Javor Sidorov, who's also a historian and researcher in Bulgaria, invites us to take a step backwards.
If we try to define Europe solely through history, we will not get very far. However, if we realize that we are building on the history of the European continent, which is the history of many very different nation-states, but at the same time a common cultural, religious, economic and political history, then it may be possible to develop a model that will lead to greater openness to new ideas and greater unity.
Relying on the past to build the future is like trying to walk on crutches. You might move, but not very far. Still, we need to understand where we come from if we want to shape a future that's shared, one that lets us all look in the same direction. I would like to thank my colleagues, Neja from Austrian Radio Agora, Dorothea from Bulgarian Radio BNR, Jean-Claude from Luxembourgish Radio 100,7, Nikos and Marianna from Sky in Greece, Auguste Arginio Radias in Lithuania, Esteban from Es Radio Castilla y León in Spain, and finally Katalin from Radio Romagna. Our next episode will also be discussing culture-related issues. We'll be looking at the question of languages in the European Union. Make sure to come back.